Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the studio for another episode of PT. This time it's part 5. We're getting closer to having something that represents what we're after in this episode. You'll also see me begin sculpting the head, twice, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about working without the model, which is what I'm doing right here. So there are certain things that I'm willing to do without the model. These are things like making my forms more readable during the blocking stage, or cleaning up the surface, which happens really late in the process obviously, or eliminating distractions, which also happens late in the process, and also filling in the spaces in between my forms. Now, in some areas, I'm more wary of this than others, but when there's a lot of space to fill, it takes a lot of work. Work that needs to happen up close and personal to your sculpture. Whenever you're up close and personal with your sculpture, you're probably not spending time looking at the model. And if you are making a mistake because you're not observing from a distance where all your questions should be answered from, and you're not observing on equal terms. Observing on equal terms means roughly that if I'm sculpting the front of my sculpture, I should look at the front of my model, not the back. And that makes a lot of sense, of course, I think, because that's a pretty crude example, but I get a lot more specific with it. If I'm attempting to sculpt a contour from the front view, it's important that the model and my sculpture are oriented and observed in the same fashion, so that what I'm looking at on my model relates well to what I'm attempting to sculpt on my sculpture. And it needs to be this way for weeks and weeks on end, because that's how long it's going to take me to sculpt it. So I need to make sure that I'm always observing on equal terms, not just once, but every single time the view needs to be the same. Now it is more important in the beginning stages, but keeping track of it and making sure that things are observed on equal term all the time, throughout time, is vital to a successful sculpture, I think. It makes everything easier, and if you haven't realized how much I like making things easier for myself, you haven't been paying attention or watching a lot of these videos. Okay, so because it's a waste of model time, which I'm paying for out of pocket myself, I don't want to spend lots of time with my model, not observing my model. Which makes sense, I think. You don't go buy dinner and then just not eat it. You don't go buy dinner if you're not hungry, essentially. That doesn't make any sense. I pay close attention to not fill the gaps in between my forms up too much, however. I want the bulk of the work out of the way before my model shows up, but I also want a little space left to add the specifics of my model when he shows up. As we spoke about in last week's episode, most of the work is done by applying clay with my hands and my wooden modeling tool, and then the cleaning up and making the surface read well and not look super muddled and messed up is achieved by using a rake tool. And again, I mentioned last time around, but I'll mention it again. This is not my finished surface, and not my finished modeling either. This is just a preliminary stage to prepare my sculpture so that the work that gets done when the model is in is done using the model. So when the model is in, you'll notice here the camera angle changed slightly, obviously because I don't want to show him naked on the internet. He won't appreciate that, I think, but part of the angle change is also that right here he's facing directly forward, and my sculpture is then situated in the same manner so that model and sculpture almost mirror each other. Keep in mind that my sculpture is in front of my model, not next to it, and as close as I can get without the sculpture getting in the way of the view of my model. Because I observe from a distance, the model and sculpture are slightly angled, so that when I step back, as far as my studio allows me to, there is no perspective distortion. So I'm observing on equal terms, even though it matters less when modeling, which is what I'm kind of doing here, than when you're blocking in the figure. I still try to keep the observation on equal terms concept alive throughout the entire process, or as much of it as possible at least. When the model is up, the actual shape and nature of the transition is closely observed, and I do my best to replicate it. Replicating it closely is only the first step, as I then try to elevate whatever I observe from life. The same thing goes for the forms, as their shape is a lot more complex than what I'm able to create in the beginning without the canvas of the clay of the transition areas. Now that the transitions are beginning to appear, I can redraw my forms closer to their actual shape and with a lot more specificity. There is a bit, if not a lot, of designing that goes into this as well. It's not pure replication, though most of what I'm after I find is there in nature. Of course, the observation needs to fit what I'm after into sculpture first and foremost. This sculpture is a lot more defined, especially in the bony areas, than my model is, but this is a conscious choice. It's a decision that I've made, not something that I accidentally stumbled into. I knew I was after this effect. The idea and the plan is that it's going to make him look less like your regular 21st century man and more closely resembling something out of a myth. Almost like he's human but not quite human at the same time. Essentially doing my best to elevate what I observe in nature so that I end up with a successful sculpture. This, I think, is a good time to mention Patreon. If you are interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work, either on email or via video chat, my Patreon page is the place for you. You will get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. You'll also get 25% off on my web store, plus accumulated credits equal to the amounts you pledge that can be used for further discounts. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. Okay, so what you're about to see here is a failed attempt at a portrait in 1 minute and change. I spoke a lot about this in part 2 when it happened to me in real time, and to boil it down, since we only have 1 minute, this failed attempt happened because I relied purely on measuring and not enough on my eyes and my instincts. Essentially, the lesson to be learned is that measurements are great, but no one cares if you measured something correctly. If the head looks small, badly placed, and the scale is not right, it doesn't matter how well we measured it. So I wasted a full 3 hours with my model, and I wasted my money to make this failed attempt. And it ruined the rest of my day, and probably the day after as well, though I can't exactly remember. Now, I wanted it to be right, and so I kept working, and I told myself it would be eventually right because the measurements were right, and so even though it looked bad, it would essentially look good after a while. But then after 3 hours, I was left with a terrible setup to continue working on. The head was too small and placed too low, giving him a small head on a short neck, which is obviously not very good at all. So the next time I decided to be honest and restart the entire portrait and get it right this time. I'm sorry about the lighting here, by the way. There's a few sections where the lighting is a little harsh, and it's because at this point in the video anyway, I just bought some video lights and I was trying to figure out how to place them, how to use them, and I made a couple of mistakes, so the light's a bit harsh in parts here. I began by redrawing the entire head, essentially eliminating everything that I had done, just leaving a bit of very underbuilt outline. And this time, I did still do a couple of measurements, but I relied a lot more on my eyes and what I wanted it to look like. Which can be tricky as well, because the way I sculpt portraits leaves me with a limited view to observe on equal terms, at least in the beginning. And I'll explain why. So why is this portrait hard? It's because I always start with the profile of the portrait, and this is usually not hard. This actually makes everything a lot easier because the profile view clearly reveals the heights of all the features and the depth at which they sit. And not only the features, but virtually everything important on the portrait can be observed from the profile. The problem I faced in this case is that only one profile view is clearly visible because of the raised arm. One side of his face is obscured by his arm, which means every important decision needs to be made from one side, and then I need to use my center line to transfer the structure of the head, of his face and his head, over to the other side, which I can't really see. Which is a lot more tricky and difficult than observing the two profile views individually and matching them from the front view. Most importantly, it makes it difficult to place the head because the head has to interact in a believable fashion with the raised arm. And so if the head is placed slightly too far to the left, which is difficult, right? Because I start off with the head quite narrow, so I have to almost make those calculations, almost make those measurements correct. But the problem is if I can't rely on my measurements, then how do I do that? And that's very difficult. So if the head is placed too far to the left, if I start off with my head placed too far to the left, it will interfere with the arm. And if it's placed too far to the right, the connection between the arm and the head will be off. And I can't measure it, right? So because I start with the profile view and can only use one profile, it's tricky to figure out where to place this profile in space. The head is also aimed slightly to the side and tilted sideways and down. So it has every movement in every axis the head could possibly have. And they're subtle movement, they're not extreme either. So this makes it even more tricky to have anything solid to compare to. What I ended up doing was relating the chin to a point on his chest. How far out did the chin come and what did it sit on top of? Because there is no way to clearly measure this, it's a bit tricky. I also used the sternocleidomastoid muscle. That's the muscle that attaches at the pit of the neck and goes up behind the ear. Kind of the big major muscle of the neck. With the exception of the trapezius, of course. So I used this muscle and measured its angle. None of these measurements are spot on and can really be trusted, right? They're not that reliable, and it takes a bit of guesswork and visual observation from a distance to place things in the right place. But this is what went wrong the first time around. I relied on unreliable measurements, and I ended up with a head in the wrong place, at the wrong scale, and a head that didn't look very good. The profile view of the portrait provides me with all the information I need, except the widths. But as you remember, I hope you remember, anyways, widths are flexible, heights are not. And so setting the heights up well before building much width is a priority, and essentially one of the reasons I do start with the profile. In my profile view, certain things I don't need to add, because when I add the widths, I'll have to redo them anyways. So for example, eyes, I don't have to add until I'm closer to having the widths that I need. I do end up usually putting placeholder lids in, but I don't intend for these to be the final thing at all. It's just to gauge the depth of the eye sockets and making sure the eyes will fit into the space of the eye sockets. Essentially making sure that I've made the eye sockets big enough. Around my center line is where I have to pay very close attention and be careful, because this is where my profile is, right? And the profile I only want to change whenever I intend to. And also because many things around my center line are very narrow. The nose, for example, is something I have to be very careful with because I can easily build it out too wide while just looking from the profile view. So while most of the work at this point is from the profile view, I check the front view to make sure that I haven't added too much clay, to make sure my center line is straight, to make sure that the right and the left side match. Essentially, I don't sculpt too much from the front view in the beginning, I just use it to make sure that I haven't deviated and are making things difficult for myself, more difficult than they need to be down the line. I also try and add widths from the profile view to create a kind of relief. I pay attention that I don't get too close to the fully realized widths. This work I want to do from the front, of course. I want to add my widths from the front. But when I get to the front, it's easier if the widths that need to be added are not too great. If there is a lot of width to be added from the front, it's easy to lose the setup I've done from the profile. When building up the beginning of the widths from the profile, I also pay very close attention to maintain the relationship these widths have from the front. So for example, if the jaw is as wide as the cheekbones, I maintain that relationship even from the profile view, which I have to double check from the front, right? Now this ensures that my model and my sculpture are relating well to each other and they look as much like each other as possible, even though my sculpture's head is about half as wide as my model's head at this point. It's essentially about making sure your sculpture and your model look as similar as possible while maintaining flexibility. A couple of other important points to note is that when the head is tilted to the side, you have to make sure you look at the profile in a flat manner, so you're not foreshortening the view of the profile by looking from above or below. Now if I look directly from a side view on this sculpture, in this case, I'd look at his profile view from below. I'd see the bottom of his jaw essentially. Same thing goes for the front, of course. His head is looking down, and so when I want to sculpt the front, I need to observe and compare by making sure I look at his face, by bending down and looking up at him to look directly into the front of his face. If I stand upright and look directly at him, I'm looking at a foreshortened face that's looking down, which makes his forehead look huge, which is not going to help me at all. Actually, it's going to hurt my chances of creating a successful portrait. And again, this brings us back to observing on equal terms. And if you don't do it, you're probably bound to fail. So keep this in mind when setting up your model when sculpting a portrait. If the model is not eye level with you and your sculpture are, it's going to be hard to compare the two to each other. The easiest way to compare something is to have them be as similar as possible so you can bounce your eye from one to the other without a lot of interruption. An example of interruption would be having to turn around or stand up or whatever. Whenever there are differences, you should be acutely aware of what these differences are going to do to your observation, so that you'll be able to watch out for them and not allow anything to compromise your sculpture. A sculpture that is set up poorly will leave you with having to make a lot of compromises. And compromises add up quickly, and I find the more compromises had to be made, the less successful their sculpture tends to be. So minimizing the compromises by observing on equal terms and not building in a ton of mistakes into your block-in will help you bring your sculpture to the next level. That's it for this week's episode. Next time I'll show you how I built my workbench, which everyone, including me, is surprised I was able to build. We probably have about 3 or 4 episodes left of the PT project. Of course, we have to make the mold as well, which is a huge project on its own, so stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several rewards, one of them being the maquette for this sculpture you've seen me working on today. So check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.